We're back now with Tom Friedman of the New York Times, Todd Purdum, who writes for both Politico and Vanity Fair. He has a new book out called An Idea Whose Time Has Come: Two Presidents, Two Parties, and the Battle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're also joined by the national editor for the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter, and our own John Dickerson. And Todd, let me talk to you first about your book. Why did you decide this was the time to do this book?
Well, obviously the anniversary's coming up, Bob, and it also seemed, the more I researched it, a wonderful story that contrasts to our dysfunctional Washington of today. It really was a time when people of both races, both parties, could manage to work together in a time that was certainly as divided, if not more so than our own, on the most controversial issue of the day. And we tend to forget just what a bipartisan achievement this was. It passed the Senate 73-27, with 27 out of 33 Republican votes. They couldn't agree on the shape of a table today by that margin.
Yeah, and you know, some people say, well, yes, but Lyndon Johnson had a Democratic Congress. He was able to push his will. Most of the people in his caucus started out against this. It was the Southern Democrats who posed the real obstacle to getting these laws passed.
Exactly, and so the size of those majorities was illusory, and he really had to depend, first in the House and then in the Senate, on the Republicans. And the Republicans at that point in time still took very seriously their heritage as the party of Lincoln, and were, to an extraordinary degree, in an election year, remember, 1964, willing to work with the president to basically neutralize the hottest political issue of the day, instead of sticking it to him and saying, why can't you get your own party to pass it?
You know what I find, that is very interesting, because this went on deep into the year.
Exactly.
Into the summer before they actually got this thing passed. For all practical purposes, our Congress has already put out the gone for the election signs.
Exactly.
Most parties have served notice they're not going to do anything for the rest of the year.
And that's another difference, too. They weren't here just 3 days a week. They were here much longer periods of time, and they knew each other. And it's a terribly hard thing to call somebody a dirty name in the morning if you've had dinner in his house the night before. And we got to be careful about not over-romanticizing that era. There were plenty of things wrong with Washington in those days. But people really did know each other as human beings, and they respected each other.
John Dickerson, do you think are there things that the Obama administration could take away from those days? And I suppose you could ask the same question of the Republicans.
There are things that they could take away. The question is whether they would really change the situation in Washington. As Todd was talking about, the Republicans who felt a deep need, a moral need to pass the civil rights legislation. If you look at some of the things the president has tried to pass, there is no group of Republicans who felt a deep moral need to have universal health care. So there was not a group that he could go grab to create a new kind of coalition. But the things he could learn is LBJ, his hobby was politics and getting to know the members on the Hill. And you talk to Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, and they say the president and his team just are not engaged. Now, would that change anything? Well, who knows? But Lyndon Johnson was either getting information or cajoling or flattering or pushing. It was just his constant occupation. He said you had to court Congress like you do your wife. And I think that would help in some way. We don't know exactly what would pass if it didn't, but clearly it's the consensus among pretty much everybody on the Hill that there needs to be more of that from a president than they've seen from this administration.
You know, Tom Friedman, and you've been around here not as long as I have, but you've been around here a long time. I think the whole talent pool has changed. The people from the pool from which our elected officials are now drawn, because when you come right down to it, if you want to be in politics today, you have to say up front, okay, I'm willing to spend 5 or 6 hours a day begging people for money, and then get up the next morning and ask the same group of people to give you some money. And the result is some of those people are elected. They're not bad people. For the most part, they're good people. But it is a very different group of people, it seems to me, than the people who used to be involved in our politics.
Well, yeah, I think of the quality of the senators and Congress people I dealt with when I came here 20 years ago on foreign affairs, how different it is. You know, Bob, I was thinking the other day that when archaeologists 1,000 years from now dig down to this layer, they're going to puzzle over something, the way we did when we dug down to the Roman layers. They're going to say, wait a minute, the president's chief of staff, arguably the second most powerful man in America, quit his job to go run, not get the job, run for office in a Midwestern city. That's Rahm Emanuel, who went to run for mayor of Chicago. Can you imagine someone who is an advisor to Caesar quitting his job to go run for mayor of Carthage, okay? So why did he do that? I think one reason he did it is, well, obviously we've got the gerrymandering of political districts, which is a huge problem, over and above all the things that have already been cited. I think there's something else going on, which is to be in public life today, in the world of Twitter, Facebook, blogging, and whatnot, is so unpleasant. And we've got now instant polling. So basically, our politics has become like American Idol. We no longer have representative democracy. We're going to direct democracy now. And as a result, that's having a huge, I think, perverting effect on the decisions people make and what we can accomplish.
So what will this latest Supreme Court ruling, what impact is that going to have, Amy, where you now are pouring more money into the system that is overflowing?
You are. But if the Citizens United case, the one that came down in 2010 and gave us the super PAC, if that were the fire hose, okay, putting all of that money in, I think this decision's more like a garden hose, which is, it's certainly adding water to the system, but nobody can compete when billionaires who have an unlimited source of money can go and run ads and put up as much money as they want into this system. And that's the difference here, which is, yes, the number of donors continues to get smaller, they give more money, but when billionaires are really putting all of their assets into these, nobody can compete, not even the parties.
I mean, this is what seems to me to be different now, is that you have people giving hundreds. I mean, what Sheldon Adelson, $93 million?
Well, and
and boy, when he snapped his finger, they all ran, the Republicans ran out there to show off for him.
A crucial figure in passing the Civil Rights Bill in the House was Congressman Bill McCulloch from West Central Ohio, and he was proud to say that he never spent more on a campaign than his congressional salary, and he never intended to do so. And that's just, it seems unimaginable.
And the great irony is that that most of these guys do sit in safe seats, right?
Redder and bluer.
They're redder and redder and bluer and bluer. Very few House members have competitive districts. So you're taking all of this money and you're putting it into fewer and fewer seats. So very few people actually have to be on the phone 5 or 6 hours because they don't have a competitive general election.
Let me also just run this in, and that is, this is not just Republicans. I mean, how much time
Democrats
does the President of the United States spend now?
Constantly.
Every time he goes out of town,
Absolutely.
he goes to a fundraiser. When he was notified of the Camp Hood, the Fort Hood situation, they had to interrupt him at a fundraiser. He spends an enormous amount of his time. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't remember presidents doing that to the extent they do it now. Am I wrong about that?
Well, he's the biggest money raiser, and he's the best tin cup shaker they've got on the Democratic side, and they need money to compete with these outside groups. But that old line about you either run unopposed or you run scared. Even people in these safe districts are running scared, so they think they need the money. It's doubled essentially what it costs to win a House race or to win a Senate race in about the last 10 years. And this goes back to the civil rights question and whether there are willing partners for a president, any president. Yep. If you buck your party and sign up with a president of the opposite party, there's a big pool of money out there waiting to attach to somebody who's going to take your job away from you. And with that kind of an environment out there, the cost of bravery of siding with a president of the other party to get anything done, like a Civil Rights Act or anything even much
Immigration.
smaller.
Well,
I cover technology a lot, okay?
Right.
So we always say of Britain and America, we're two countries divided by a common language. Well, we're not two coasts divided by a common language. When you're in Silicon Valley and you call someone a collaborator, that's someone you're building a great new piece of technology and software with. You come to Washington and you call someone a collaborator, it's in the John Dickerson sense. You're someone who dared to work with the other party. You're a collaborator in the Vichy French sense of the term. Same word, two coasts, means something totally different.
Except all this money, too, we don't necessarily know that it's actually doing much. I mean, there's a law of diminishing returns, right? How many millions of dollars can you put on television before people just completely tune it out? And so I think that on immigration reform, this is the perfect example of the civil rights of our time. If you quietly, if we took the Republican conference, put them in a room, said this is all off the record, you'd get 60% of the people in that room saying, I would vote for an immigration bill. But they're either worried about a primary or they're worried that somehow, some way, they will be called out for being not loyal.
I think the amazing thing is that the big money has not completely taken over our politics, and it hasn't. I mean, it is this enormous force. But, you know, if Sheldon Adelson was going to prevail, Newt Gingrich would have been elected
Yeah.
president.
But Bob,
He got most of Adelson's money.
If you look
last
at it, though,
time.
on a micro scale, why is it hedge fund managers pay a different tax on carried interest than you and me? Why was it that General Motors was able to actually block the study of mileage improvement standards for many years? You know, why is it we can't import sugar ethanol from Brazil? You can go down the list and look at a lot of things that were just bought and paid for. I think Bill Maher got it right. The Supreme Court justices who said this doesn't lead to corruption were like the Little Mermaid. These are people who have never run for office.
All right. So what happens next? What's happening on the Republican side? I think most people think right now Hillary Clinton is going to get the Democratic nomination, which may be the main reason she doesn't get it. We all assume that that's what's going to happen. And what we always assume somehow never seems to happen in politics. What is happening on the Republican side,
Well,
Amy?
if the Democratic side is a very strong front runner, but a pretty weak bench underneath that, on the Republican side you have a really deep bench and no front runner. And that's what Republicans are trying to figure out. Who do they want to be that standard bearer for them? And if you talk to the establishment folks, they would like somebody who they think matches up best against Hillary Clinton. So that's why Jeb Bush's name gets raised, especially as Chris Christie's star has dimmed a bit. But Jeb Bush brings his own set of baggage to this race. The last poll that we saw from the Washington Post showed that 49% of Americans said they definitely would not vote for him. It's not because they know Jeb Bush, they just know the Bush last name.
And the problem the Republicans face is that all the factors that are helping this year in the midterm in individual districts and Senate races are the same factors that will hurt them as a national brand in 2016, just as they suffered in 2008 and 2012 against Barack Obama.
And what is the impact of Obamacare on all this? We said, we had Dan Pfeiffer on this morning. You got to give them credit. Most people thought this was not going to happen, and they did get over 7 million finally signed up after this disastrous rollout. But is that going to help, or is it going to hurt Democrats, John?
Well, they haven't had a good news day for 6 months since this thing launched, and then they had basically 2 months of bad news days. So it was the first time they could claim something was going well. We still don't know what that number means, as we've all discussed, how many people have actually paid versus enrolled, where, how are they healthy, and all of that. But the best thing for Democrats is this may sort of neutralize the issue a little bit so they can change the topic. They're never going to be able to use Obamacare as a weapon against Republicans. But if it's not front and center, something they're constantly having to hold a shield up and cower behind, they can perhaps go on the offense about something else, whether it's equal pay or the minimum wage or unemployment insurance or whatever local thing. They want these races that are going to be tight in red states to be very local about local issues. So they can maybe start that conversation. But Republicans are not going to change their approach, which is to talk about this not just as a law that had stumbles in October, but that one that represents a grab of 18% of the economy and represents a kind of mindset as a part of the Democrats. And that works very well with their base, which is the base that turns out in these midterm elections, and that gets energized about this as a values proposition, which is to say this is against my values about the way a government should work. And that still has plenty of energy despite the 7.1 million signups.
And as long as most Americans don't think that the economy is getting better, the message on equal pay and we're working for the middle class is just not really going to resonate. And that's the bigger problem for Democrats right now. It's that, yes, Obamacare is a drag. It motivates the other side. Their side is not as motivated by the fact that this passed as the other side is motivated by the fact that it passed. And when you're talking about the people that need to turn out for Democrats to succeed, there are people who are making less than $50,000 a year. Those people are not feeling like this economy is roaring back to life.
But the economy is getting better, isn't
For
it?
some people.
By some yardsticks.
Yeah, by some yardstick, but
Well,
people
I mean,
aren't believing
jobs,
it. They're coming back.
Unemployment is now up beyond where it was before the Great
The
Recession.
percentage of people that say we think the country's headed in the wrong direction or we don't feel that much better about where the country is economically is still, that's still a bigger problem. If by November people are truly feeling better about where the economy is going, that's what's going to help to offset the Obamacare
Do you think
stumbles.
that the Republicans could take the Senate? They have to run the table.
Sure.
They've got to take 6
They have a lot of
seats.
opportunity. Well, they need to take 6 seats. There are 7 seats up this year that Democrats hold that Mitt Romney carried. So that
in that state.
That's a tough map for Democrats. But they've also expanded it into battleground states like Iowa, Michigan, Colorado, places that Democrats win, but not by big margins. So they've definitely have a best opportunity they've had. The bigger problem, and John raised this, is what kind of candidates are Republicans going to get? Can Democrats localize these races by making it not so much about how great Democrats are, but how terrible the Republican candidate is, how terrible they've been on the issues that matter in those individual
You know,
states?
Todd, you've just done this book, so let me ask you this question. I mean, when I go out and talk to people, and I sometimes say I'm pretty discouraged about the way our politics is, because I think the whole system is totally broken. And of course, the first question you get is, what can we do about it? What do you see? Do you see anything that changes the situation in which we find ourselves now?
Well, I mean, as Tom said, the problem with the red and blue districts, we don't have competitive seats. But I think I've pondered that question a lot during my research. And really, the crucial key to passing the Civil Rights Act was this enormous grassroots lobbying effort by the religious community, interfaith community all over the country. And they targeted their efforts specifically in the Midwest and Great Plains, where people didn't have large black constituencies or liberal or labor groups, but they had a lot of Methodists and Catholics and Baptists. And I've often wondered what would happen on an issue like immigration if somehow the Conference of Catholic Bishops got together with the strain of the evangelical movement for whom economic justice is an important issue. And I wonder, could they put pressure to bear on some of these even safe districts? And I wonder, but short of that,
So
I don't.
You're sort of suggesting divine intervention here.
Well,
we wrestle this
No, I'm
we
kidding
wrestle
you.
with this on climate, which is that, as Todd said, what made the Civil Rights Act? We had 1 million people on the mall. What made the women's movement? We had massive turnout of women. No one. It's very hard to get people to turn out for a carbon tax.
You know, they've tried that. We've tried to get faith leaders to give cover to some Republican members. And what ends up happening, though, or has happened in this case, is Republican leaders have said, we don't want to have this fight in the Republican Party over immigration in an election year where we're likely to win back the Senate. So let's...
They want the issue, not the bill.
That's right. And they're not feeling enough pressure to bring it to the floor for a big, nice, open, messy debate in a year when they like to keep the big, nice, open, messy debate about Obamacare.
Well, so let's see what happens if they lose the presidential race one more time, if they lose in 2016 because they once again lose minority voters. That's the time when you will see an immigration bill. And it may take up to that point of, well, we've lost a third presidential election in a row.
And
That's 20 seconds.
That's part of what's fueling the Jeb Bush conversations.
Yep.
They think he has a special conversation with Hispanic voters. Although it's gotten so interesting in the Republican field, a big money donor in the Republican field was raising Bob Gates' name as somebody to try and draft into the 2016, the former defense secretary. They are looking for them in high and low.
I
for a
don't think
candidate.
you would drag Bob Gates into the team of news at this point. If I take what he said in his
I
book
think
to be
that's
the
right.
truth. Thank you all very much. We'll be back in a minute with a look at what some of our former presidents are up to these days.